At 4:19 a.m., in the pitch-black waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the billion-dollar digital brain of the USS Spruance went temporarily blind. A massive electronic wall, a high-powered jamming system upgraded with Russian and Chinese technology, slammed into the destroyer, severing its critical data links to the sky. Simultaneously, 6 Nor anti-ship missiles, skimming just inches above the cresting waves, hurtled toward the isolated warship. For the forces operating from coastal bases in Bandar Abbas, this was intended to be the ultimate knockout blow. They had executed a sophisticated ambush, combining ghost fleets, suicide drones, and heavy electromagnetic interference to shatter American naval operations. It was designed as an asymmetric triumph, or so they believed. The brutal reality, however, was entirely different. The sudden radar interference on the USS Spruance was not an American operational failure. It was the precise moment an inescapable digital cage snapped shut. To understand the invisible architecture of modern warfare, you must look beyond the headlines. Subscribe to the Strategic Briefing and uncover how the next global conflict will actually be fought. For 72 hours, the claustrophobic transit corridor of the Strait of Hormuz had been simmering with an invisible, high-stakes friction. Iran's so-called ghost fleet had been continuously testing American reflexes, utilizing sophisticated AIS spoofing tactics to paint phantom signals across surface radar scopes. This was the preamble to a much larger, asymmetrical gamble. At exactly 4:05 a.m., the atmospheric tension fractured. A concentrated formation of IRGC fast attack boats surged from the maritime shadows, accelerating to 30 knots along a deadly, converging vector aimed directly at the USS Spruance. To the uninitiated observer, this looks like raw maritime aggression. Geopolitically, it is a meticulously calculated sleight of hand designed to mask terminal failure. In a desperate bid to deceive the Lockheed Martin Aegis combat system, the Iranian crews executed a dark ship protocol. They severed their legitimate AIS emissions, digitally masquerading as a cluster of neutral merchant vessels navigating the congested artery. It was an illusion built on the premise that the American destroyer would hesitate before firing on what appeared to be civilian bulk carriers. The bridge of the Spruance broadcasted stern, unmistakable warnings over Link 16 tactical data links. The response from the approaching swarm was absolute, cold silence. No acknowledgement was given, and no change of course was plotted. By 4:08 a.m., the Iranian flotilla was aggressively flouting every established maritime rule, burning fuel and time as they charged relentlessly toward the terminal kill zone. This maneuver exposes the core paradox of Iran's anti-access area denial, or A2AD doctrine. When a nation-state is economically strangled by global sanctions and inherently lacks the industrial capacity to field a true blue-water navy, it cannot fight a symmetric, conventional war. It must rely on the weaponization of geography and the psychology of chaos. The swarm of fast attack craft is not a projection of overwhelming maritime strength. It is a symptom of severe strategic desperation. Tehran deployed these vessels not to sink a billion-dollar guided missile destroyer with light munitions, but to act as a localized kinetic distraction. They sought to overload the threat assessment bandwidth of the human operators aboard the Spruance, forcing the ship's defensive posture to focus downward, locking onto the surface anomalies rushing across the dark water. The IRGC commanders believed this chaotic swarm tactic would afford them the crucial seconds needed to deploy their true, overarching arsenal. They assumed that by saturating the immediate threat environment with fast-moving targets, they could temporarily paralyze American decision-making. This is the fatal flaw in their geopolitical calculus. They viewed the USS Spruance as a solitary fortress floating in a hostile sea, vulnerable to being overwhelmed by sheer numbers, spoofed telemetry, and localized confusion. The brutal reality is that the United States Navy no longer deploys isolated fortresses. The Spruance was never relying solely on its own organic sensors. It is simply the kinetic fist of a massive, distributed digital organism. As the Iranian speedboats closed the final distance, supremely confident in their maritime deception, the inescapable architecture of American naval dominance was already dissecting their trap from an altitude of 25,000 feet. While the crew on the bridge of the USS Spruance monitored the approaching surface swarm, the Aegis combat system abruptly triggered an independent, Level 1 red alert. This was never merely a surface engagement. 40 minutes prior, mobile launchers concealed deep within the jagged, unforgiving topography of the Musandam Peninsula had unleashed a swarm of Shahed 136 loitering munitions. Engineered to evade conventional radar horizons, these cheap suicide drones skimmed aggressively just above the wave crests, maintaining a strict altitude of less than 100 feet. Tehran's overarching strategy was a masterclass in multi-domain deception. They weaponized the speedboats alongside 3 zombie ships, disabling their legitimate AIS transponders to broadcast fraudulent telemetry and manufacture massive localized chaos. The objective was elementary. They wanted American operators hyper-fixated on the kinetic tricks unfolding on the water, entirely oblivious to the lethal payload screaming through the lower atmosphere. But the USS Spruance operates under a fundamentally different doctrine. It is not a standalone fortress. It is merely a hardened node within an unseverable digital network. The destroyer's Combat Information Center instantly established a real-time tether with a Northrop Grumman E-2D Advanced Hawkeye. This airborne command apparatus had launched from the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln in the Gulf of Oman, anchoring a steady, invisible orbit at 25,000 feet. Through the architecture of cooperative engagement capability, the Hawkeye functions as the apex predator of the information space. Utilizing its immense UHF radar power, the aircraft effortlessly filtered through the electronic noise and identified the fraudulent zombie signals polluting the surface picture. It stripped away the Iranian digital camouflage with mathematical precision. The Hawkeye bypassed the Spruance's localized sensors, transmitting pristine, weapons-quality targeting telemetry directly into the destroyer's combat suite. The fog of war evaporated. With the battle space illuminated, the kinetic execution was terrifyingly swift. At exactly 4:15 a.m., 4 Boeing FA-18EF Super Hornets plunged violently into the combat corridor. Having left the Lincoln's flight deck a mere 90 seconds earlier, these aircraft were not hunting for targets. They were data-linked executioners arriving to clean up a mathematical certainty. Leveraging the absolute tactical awareness generated by Raytheon's APG-79 AESA radar, the fighter pilots commanded the airspace. They simply arrived and erased. In a staggering display of asymmetrical overmatch, 11 incoming Shahed munitions were systematically obliterated from the sky in exactly 47 seconds. The immediate atmospheric threat was vaporized. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the American strike group believed they had completely neutralized the complex aerial ambush and secured total, irreversible dominance over the information domain. The surface swarm was thoroughly compromised, and the drone wave was falling in burning pieces into the Persian Gulf. To the naked eye, the Iranian strategy was fundamentally broken, but Tehran was perfectly willing to sacrifice cheap drones and fiberglass boats. As the final flaming wreckage of the last Shahed drone crashed into the dark sea at 4:19 a.m., the illusion of American victory shattered, and the real trap was finally sprung. From the fortified coastal batteries of Bandar Abbas, a massive coordinated electronic wall was violently activated. This was not conventional static interference. It was a high-power electromagnetic jamming system, heavily augmented by advanced Russian and Chinese architectural transfers, designed specifically to suffocate American data links. Simultaneously, 6 Noor anti-ship cruise missiles, an aggressive, heavily modified evolution of the C-802 platform, ignited from fixed launchers hidden on Keshem Island. Skimming the dark water at Mach 0.9, these lethal warheads were not the primary weapon. They were the physical executioners sent in only after the digital guillotine dropped. Aboard the USS Spruance, the once pristine Aegis displays began to severely degrade. Critical telemetry streams, tying the destroyer to the omniscient E-2D Hawkeye, fractured under the immense weight of the electromagnetic assault. The billion-dollar warship was momentarily blinded, isolated within a suffocating digital blackout, with exactly 180 seconds before the Noor missiles would impact the hull. For the Iranian operators orchestrating the assault from the mainland shadows, this was the defining moment of their military doctrine. They genuinely believed that by overwhelming the electromagnetic spectrum, they could strip a high-value American asset of its networked immunity and reduce it to a defenseless target of vulnerable steel. It was a sophisticated, high-stakes gamble built on a fatal assumption. They assumed the United States Navy treats electronic warfare purely as a defensive measure, scrambling to hold a shield against the static. They were catastrophically mistaken. The United States Navy does not merely endure the spectrum. It weaponizes it with terminal prejudice. Operating at the absolute atmospheric limits over the Gulf of Oman, a Boeing EA-18G Growler pushed its twin engines to maximum afterburner. The Growler is not a traditional fighter platform. It is a dedicated Apex electronic attack apparatus. It did not plunge into the airspace to dogfight or deploy kinetic munitions. It arrived specifically to shatter the Iranian digital architecture. Engaging its advanced systems, the aircraft unleashed a terrifying offensive payload of spoof jamming and highly concentrated point jamming. The Growler did not simply deflect the Iranian interference. It executed a maneuver designed to violently blind the blinder. By weaponizing the electronic attack and driving it back into the coastal nodes, the Growler carved a massive digital breach straight through the Iranian jamming wall, permanently scrambling the coastal radar arrays from Bandar Abbas to Qeshm Island. With the Spruance's communication umbilicals instantly re-established through the Growler's engineered breach, the kinetic cleanup was almost anticlimactic in its mechanical perfection. The airborne Super Hornets seamlessly transitioned their APG-79 radars for low-altitude tracking, launching a lethal volley of AIM-120 AMRAAMs that annihilated the Lead-Nor missiles miles over the horizon. Closer to the destroyer, the Spruance's automated vertical launch systems erupted. SM-2 interceptors ripped into the surviving threats, while the Phalanx CIWS unleashed a mathematically flawless, radar-guided hail of tungsten rounds, shredding the final rogue missile a mere 500 yards from the hull. The entire defensive envelope functioned as a chaotic but perfectly orchestrated symphony of automated violence. At 4:32 a.m., the skies over the Strait of Hormuz were violently cleared. The electromagnetic domain belonged wholly to the Americans. Yet, the adrenaline aboard the Spruance had barely plateaued before a far more insidious, utterly silent threat began its deadly ascent from the crushing darkness beneath the waterline. At 4:35 a.m., the atmospheric adrenaline had barely stabilized before a more terrifying, entirely invisible threat emerged from the deep water trench. While the American strike group systematically dismantled the blazing skies, Tehran calculated this was the perfect operational window to strike from the abyss. Hidden for 48 hours in the treacherous, 80-foot shallows of the strait, a Ghadir-class mini-submarine began its terminal approach. Running strictly on battery power to erase its acoustic emissions, the Iranian crew believed they were a silent, apex predator, virtually undetectable to the conventional hull-mounted sonar of the American destroyer. They surged to periscope depth in exactly 30 seconds, establishing a rapid, lethal fire solution. Their payload was an apocalyptic cocktail: 4 smart mines armed with magnetic sensors, trailed instantly by 2 U-3 torpedoes. The engagement distance was a suffocating 1,200 yards. In the unforgiving geometry of naval combat, this is point-blank execution range. Tehran's ultimate gamble relied on a critical acoustic assumption. They believed the sonar technicians aboard the Spruance were momentarily deafened, their hydrophones overwhelmed by the concussive shockwaves of the kinetic intercepts and the lingering static of the Growler's electronic breach. They assumed the dark littoral waters offered an impenetrable shield. They were fundamentally wrong. The era of diesel-electric stealth in contested choke points is permanently dead. The United States Navy does not wait to be hunted in the shallows. Days before the Iranian submarine even slipped its mainland moorings, an inescapable underwater net had already been deployed. Silently loitering in the crushing depths was Boeing's Orca extra-large unmanned undersea vehicle. This was not a reactive defensive measure. It was a completely autonomous, robotic sentinel designed to permanently strip away the ocean's opacity. Operating without the biological constraints of human fatigue or life support, the Orca had quietly acquired the Ghadir's acoustic fingerprint the moment it entered the maritime corridor. It had been stalking the Iranian crew for days, essentially transforming their perceived deep-water sanctuary into a fully illuminated digital kill box. The subsequent execution sequence was terrifyingly mechanical. As the Ghadir raised its periscope, a Boeing P-8 Poseidon patrolling high above instantly detected the minute surface anomaly. The aircraft relentlessly blanketed the grid with 12 Raytheon sonobuoys, dropping a sudden, impassable acoustic wall across the channel. Simultaneously, a Sikorsky MH-60R Seahawk helicopter hovered directly over the churning coordinates. Beneath the waves, the Orca seamlessly uploaded pristine, real-time targeting telemetry straight into the Seahawk's combat framework. Without hesitation, the helicopter deployed a Raytheon Mark 54 lightweight torpedo into the dark water. It was a flawless, cold-blooded math problem solved in exactly 2 minutes and 12 seconds. The underwater crisis was violently obliterated before the Iranian munitions could even arm. Tehran had played its final, most insidious trump card. The drone swarm was burning wreckage, the hypersonic missiles were tungsten-shredded debris. The hidden submarine was now a shattered steel tomb settling on the ocean floor. The multi-domain ambush was comprehensively crushed, but for the commanders coordinating the battlespace from the USS Spruance, mere survival was never the strategic objective. The defensive phase of the engagement had just officially concluded. It was time to systematically dismantle the adversary's capacity to ever try again. At 4:55 a.m., the immediate tactical chaos subsided, leaving the USS Spruance entirely intact, gliding through waters now littered with the burning composite debris of Tehran's shattered asymmetric doctrine. To the untrained eye, this was a localized 47-minute military crisis, gracefully averted by overwhelming American firepower. But viewing this engagement purely through a military lens is a fundamental failure of strategic comprehension. The actual battlefield was never just the 21-mile-wide geographic bottleneck of the Strait of Hormuz. The true battle space was the fragile, deeply interconnected architecture of the global macroeconomic system. If the Iranian commanders had succeeded in their gambit, if those Nord missiles had bypassed the electromagnetic wall and crippled an American guided missile destroyer, the resulting geopolitical shockwave would have triggered a terminal hemorrhage across the world's supply chains. The illusion perpetuated by mainstream geopolitical commentary is that the United States Navy heavily patrols this specific maritime choke point to protect American domestic energy interests. This is an outdated paradigm, a relic of a bygone geopolitical era. The brutal reality is defined by the American shale revolution. The United States is functionally energy independent, a net exporter operating entirely outside the immediate vulnerability of Middle Eastern petroleum politics. When the USS Spruance vaporized the Iranian drone swarm, it was not defending the energy grid of New York or Texas. Ironically, it was defending the industrial capacity of Beijing, Tokyo, and Seoul. Through this narrow, treacherous transit corridor flows roughly 20% of the world's liquid energy, trillions of dollars in crude oil, and crucially, a massive percentage of the global liquefied natural gas emanating from Qatar. If the Spruance had burned, the immediate secondary effect would not have been a localized war. It would have been the instantaneous activation of actuarial algorithms in London. Marine insurance underwriters at Lloyd's would have immediately revoked or astronomically inflated the war risk premiums for any commercial hull attempting to enter the Persian Gulf. Commercial shipping does not sail without insurance. Overnight, the physical flow of global energy would drop to absolute zero. This creates an irreversible macroeconomic cascade. Without the uninterrupted flow of Gulf energy, the export-driven manufacturing hubs of Asia would face immediate power rationing and severe industrial paralysis. The microchips, raw materials, and finished goods that the Western world relies upon would cease production. European energy grids, already strained by the geopolitical fallout of the Ukrainian conflict, would face catastrophic winter shortfalls deprived of Qatari gas. The global supply chain, heavily optimized for just-in-time delivery with zero built-in redundancy, would experience a structural collapse within weeks. Inflationary pressures would rip through the global market with the violence of a kinetic weapon. Therefore, Tehran's sophisticated ambush was never fundamentally about sinking a ship. It was a calculated attempt to hold the physical infrastructure of globalization hostage, utilizing the threat of global economic ruin as a geopolitical lever to shatter American sanctions. The IRGC assumed that Washington lacked the stomach for an escalatory multi-domain conflict in such a fragile economic artery. What they violently discovered is that the United States Navy does not just patrol the choke point. It has engineered an inescapable digital cage to ensure the absolute fluidity of the global order. And as the dawn broke over the Persian Gulf, the terrifying reality of that cage became undeniable. At 5:15 a.m., witnessing their grand multi-domain illusion shattered and their kinetic forces reduced to burning composite on the surface, IRGC commanders ordered a total chaotic retreat. They withdrew into the coastal shadows of Bandar Abbas, leaving behind nothing but charred debris and the catastrophic wreckage of their asymmetric doctrine. The desperate gamble to break America's economic stranglehold resulted in a terminal strategic defeat. To the uninitiated global public, this would eventually be reported as a terrifying 47-minute crisis that nearly sparked a global, macroeconomic war. But on the bridge of the USS Spruance, the combat alert levels were methodically lowered with cold, administrative precision. It was not a miraculous survival against overwhelming odds. It was a mathematical inevitability executed by a flawless digital machine. Tehran's sophisticated ambush was engineered to be a decisive knockout blow against a solitary, vulnerable target. They fundamentally failed to comprehend that the United States Navy no longer fights with individual ships. It fights with an omnipresent, multi-layered kill web that commands every inch of the battle space, from the high-altitude data streams to the crushing depths of the ocean floor. The destruction of the Iranian flotilla is not a localized triumph. It is a terrifying broadcast to every peer adversary contemplating the weaponization of global trade routes. You cannot outmaneuver an opponent who holds absolute supremacy over the electromagnetic spectrum. You cannot ambush an enemy who already maps the ocean floor with autonomous, tireless robotics. The illusion of the vulnerable American Leviathan is permanently dead. The reality is a digital cage of autonomous sentinels and hypersonic intercepts that guarantees the uninterrupted flow of global capital, violently neutralizing anything that steps into the firing line. Tehran's asymmetric doctrine just met a wall of absolute cold integration. But as uncrewed robotic platforms like the Orca XLUUV continue to completely replace human operators in the deep water, quietly mapping the choke points of global trade, we must ask a deeply uncomfortable question. If the next major global conflict is fought and won by autonomous algorithms before human commanders even realize a trap has been set, who truly holds the ultimate leverage in the world's most critical maritime artery? Let me know your strategic assessment in the comments below.